Good afternoon. Now that you all exercised yourself in one form or another, I'm Patricia Alexander, and I have the sincere pleasure of introducing today's keynote, this afternoon's keynote, Dr. Gavin Brown. I think my history with Gavin goes back well over a decade. I still talk to him, so that's a good sign, and he still talks to me, so this is good. A few things about Gavin that would be evident in something like his vita is that Gavin is in the School of, let me get it right, Learning, Development, and Professional Practice at the University of Auckland. He is a professor there, and he is also the Associate Dean for Postgraduate Research, as well as he directs something called the Quantitative Analysis and Research Unit there. Gavin is, by all stretches of the imagination, extremely prolific. Over 6,000 citations to your work. I happen to read them all. Yeah, I did not. Over 180 publications, including books, monographs, and research articles. And as I said, what's always impressed me about Gavin is that he takes assessment in a direction that's very, very meaningful to those of us who spend many years in the educational system as a public school teacher, and then into the university to try to change the face of what goes on in classrooms, and assessment being key there. He brings together a marriage of psychometrics and this concern for what I would call the human factors, social, cultural factors. And he marries them in a way that's very, very unique in the literature. And that's one of the things that's so powerful. I had also the privilege of overseeing his handbook with Dr. Harris on human factors in assessment that I hope you all get a chance to peruse, to look at, as well as he did an insights book, which is a very accessible summary on student achievement. So again, these are two publications I'm very familiar with that capture the essence of what is concerning him. But on a personal note, and I promised him I wouldn't say anything too bad, so I won't. But on a personal note, I asked him about and I know something about his history, and I said, tell me something that I might not know. And he said, I call myself an adult, third culture child, third culture kid. And I said, I've never heard that expression before. And he said, that's someone who has lived in nations around the world for which you own no passport or have no passport. And as evidence of that, if you know anything about Gavin's history, he was born in Scotland, which explains why he's tight. No, did I just say that stereotypically? No. And then he spent 10 years in Canada. Then after that, he spent from the age of 10 to age 21 in Western Europe. He eventually found his way back to Montreal, where he spent 7 years, and then he goes to New Zealand, where that's where you landed in 1983, I believe. And so he's been in Auckland for a good portion of his life from that point. And yet, of course, being the travel person that he is, that doesn't mean he was also in Hong Kong for, was it 3 years? 3 years. In Hong Kong at the Hong Kong Institute for Education. And then also he has an affiliate status at the University of Umeå in Sweden. It just happens that his kid's in Sweden, so it's probably a connection to that as well. And he's very much a family man, and I've met his children, beautiful little grandchildren, just lovely. But today he's going to bring all of those concerns together for us. And he's going to, as the title says, and of course he has to throw Latin in there to show how well educated he is, the products, processes, psychology and technology, and then this, for those who don't know Latin, it really means where you're going, right? Where are you going in terms of educational assessment, Vadis. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause to Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Pat. That's a lovely introduction. Allow me to tell you what I'm going to do, but first a little more about myself. As Pat said, Dundee is home in Scotland. That's the River Tay. And in New Zealand, we will like to tell you about our river, our mountain, and our family. So my river is the River Tay, which kind of goes back up into the mountains where you find the water of life, which you might know as whiskey. So that's a very important beverage because it gives you life. Mount Royal is home. It's a mountain. Really, it's just a little hill, but there's a cross on it, and that means a lot to me. And my clan is Lamont. We got beat up by all the big clans, so you probably never heard of Lamont or Lamont. We're kind of nobodies, but that's our clan and our motto. And I have, as Pat said, a married son in Sweden with 2 grandchildren, so I go to Sweden as much as I can so I can be farfar, which is the Swedish for father's father. It also means I'm far, far away. I have 2 children, one married and one now engaged in central Alberta, Canada. So you give passports to your children, they travel, they fall in love with foreigners, and then they never come home. It's a real sadness for the modern world. And frankly, physical presence is not substituted by Zoom or Skype or any other cyber means. And I have one daughter who lives in New Zealand, very close to us, and we're very happy she's there because it keeps my wife from going insane looking after me because traveling with Gavin can be hard work. What I want to talk about, when I saw the theme of this conference, I immediately thought about where have we come from, where are we now, and where are we going in educational assessment. And so that's going to be the structure of my talk. I want to say, most of the history you probably know. You may have some understanding of where we are, and I hope to point out some of the threats and challenges and opportunities for us going into the future. So where have we come from in educational assessment? The earliest I can find formal assessment goes back to the Chinese imperial exam system, which you can roughly date to about 500 BC. So we're talking 2,500 to 3,000 years old formal assessment systems. And they really had it organized, folks. They really had a very strong assessment system. In the photo on, I guess, your left, yes, on the left, if you could zoom in it, you would see all the little cells in which people were kept so that they could individually work on answering the questions that they were all given. Common tasks, common responses, under controlled conditions, just like we do at university examinations. And the consequence of doing well was important. The gentleman on the right is wearing a symbol that says he's passed a certain level of examinations, and therefore he's important socially. And also, like still today in China, lists of names go on walls with exam scores, and people crowd around it to find out where in the list they are. And of course, there's only 3 people who can be first, second, and third, and unfortunately, in the experience I've seen with Chinese students, everyone else is a loser. Even if you're number 100 in the best school, you're still number 100. It's a problem. Because success mattered, there was cheating. The Chinese if you could zoom in and read that, you would see characters there that were cheat and crib notes on how to write this Confucian essay. And of course, there were systems of invigilation so that you could see that no one was running around giving crib notes or pass notes or whatever. The European assessment system really comes out of the church, where there was a system of appointing people for deacons, priests, bishops, cardinals, popes, and you got elected, and there was a selection and a choice system to become a higher rank. At the same time, our mechanical guilds and trades had a system for saying, you're an apprentice, and you work here for 7 years, and we get to beat you up with sticks or whatever, and if you succeed, at the end, you become a journeyman, and eventually you might become someone who's a master who trains others. And universities all over Europe began around 1100-ish, and many of them have adopted much the same model as the clerical system. We have an entry requirement, a degree graduation requirement. You become a master and a doctor, and you can become a teacher. And all of these systems required a very profound system. We asked you to answer questions, to dispute, debate, and demonstrate your scholarly command of a field of knowledge or your physical command of the ability to build certain pieces of furniture if you were working in carpentry, and so on. And other people judged and evaluated, how good is this? Is it enough to enter our club? Just like we do now with doctoral examinations, where we decide if 2, 3, maybe if you're lucky, 5 people decide you belong in the club. And these traditions continue. University exams still have rows, paper, and so we're starting to experiment with innovations, but we still have this notion of a standardized, long-written examination, which sometimes we do orally, but a lot of times for efficiency, we do in writing. Why do we do this? Well, we need to select talent. Systems of government and bureaucracies require people who can deal with numbers and people who can deal with text and demonstrate competence with text. And so we need people who can do these things. We may not need as many as want those jobs, so we can use the assessments to ration rewards, identify the very best. It also is a way of giving hope if you don't happen to be born into the aristocracy. If you don't happen to be born with money, it's a way to escape poverty and hard labor. And it gives people hope that things could be better for at least my children than me. It's also recognized as a way of stopping corruption, collusion, and nepotism. And the Chinese position is very simple. If we didn't have exams, how would we select people for rewards or opportunities? Well, we might end up selecting people based on who your uncle is, or we might base it on how much money you can deliver to the person who makes the decision, or we might actually collaborate together to give people the rewards that they want. And exams were a way of saying, well, we can cancel out some of those threats to the validity of the decision. As a consequence of this, we have a mechanism in which assessment is used summatively to evaluate. And we still do this. Frankly, I don't want to fly in an airplane unless the pilot has passed the summative evaluation with a lot more than 51% accuracy. We end up with schooling, which ends up being just preparation for the final exam. And we end up with assessment in schools and classrooms is very simple. How do we mimic the final exam? And that's, for many of us, that's the world we grew up in because it still exists today. So what are some of the challenges for us? Well, unfortunately, some of the challenges are that judging people's work in writing is notoriously unreliable. It may be valid in some way, but we're not very good, we're not very good at marking it. We are unreliable and inconsistent within ourselves and between ourselves. This is a fundamental problem of human judgment and human evaluation processes. We get seduced, we get distracted, we get angry, so marks go down. We're happy, marks go up. We get tired, marks go down. We are the problem. Because of that, we invented, 100 years ago, the multiple choice question system. It gives the appearance of objectivity. There's only one answer, and a machine can score it, so it seems free from the pollution of the subjective human. It allows you to cover a lot of things very efficiently in a short period of time. It's relatively efficient and simple, but of course, we all know how easy it is to write really bad multiple choice questions. This is one of the easiest things to do, to write a bad multiple choice question. Writing good ones is hard, so they may be consistent and reliable, but often they're far from valid, and sometimes we can't even assume that they're reliable, let alone valid. And in fact, giving the power to write these kinds of questions to ordinary instructors and examiners in higher ed, a paper we did and showed that, well, most of them were really badly written according to the statistical principles. Talking of statistics, in the last 100 years, the world of psychometrics has invented an amazing number of statistical tools and techniques for examining tests. We have the classical test theory, and so everybody learns about mean, mode, and median. We learn about the standard deviation and standard error and the standard error measurement. And then if we're lucky, we might have been taught something about dimensionality with scale reliability and factor analysis. Fewer of us get taught about item analysis for looking at the difficulty and discrimination of items, let alone using item response theory. We then have the magic black arts of psychometrics, of trying to equate two different tests, finding a representative sample against which to create norms, to judge where is the cut score, where do you go from unacceptable to okay, to good, to excellent. Those cut scores are part of a political process, not a statistical process. We have ways of working out group differences, whether some groups have the same score by more than chance and differ by that. So we have the chi-square, the analysis of variance, differential item functioning, and variance testing. And then we can look at the association of those scores with other factors through correlations, regressions, path analysis, and structural equation models. All of that already exists. And in my world, I want my students to learn all this stuff because I think it's important. But that's my prejudice. But again, we have the question of what are we testing? What are we assessing? And we do that through defining a curriculum. And I've seen papers on, we're looking at these key competencies, these soft skills, these higher order thinking skills, these important competencies for the future. These are really important, but they're hard to assess. We're really not very good at assessing them. It's easier to just say, well, we're going to assess what's in this textbook. And so curriculum in some countries is just what's in the textbook. And so we teach the textbook, and then the kids should be able to do well on the exam or assessment. And then, of course, we fall into the trap of the really easy stuff to test. That's what we put in the tests, and we value the tests. And so we end up assessing the easy-to-test stuff instead of the important and valuable stuff. And that's a real challenge for us as a community of people working in assessment. Michael Scriven in the 60s developed this notion of formative and summative evaluation, which we're still fighting and arguing over. What is formative assessment? What is summative assessment? And for me, it's really simple. Formative is before the end, when we have a chance to make a difference. Summative is at the end, we're not going to make any differences. And Bob Stake says, the chef tastes the soup, the customer tastes the soup. When the chef tastes it, he can make some modifications to the recipe. When the customer tastes it, he either decides this is amazing or this is no good and sends it back or pays for it. Notice the assessment is the same, tasting the soup. And it's just who has the power to do something about it, to make a change. And certainly, that's one of the wonders of education. We find out what kids don't know, didn't learn, despite our best efforts, and maybe we can make some changes. Psychometrics actually grew out of psychology. All that stuff about factors and correlations, Spearman, Pearson, Galton, these guys were all psychologists. So somewhere along the line, the field I feel I'm in of the assessment of psychological attributes has somehow been partitioned out of psychology. And I think that's a real mistake. It's become fundamentally a form of statistics. And now what we're seeing coming towards us very rapidly in learning analytics and big data is it's becoming computer science. And that is really strange to me because fundamentally what we're trying to assess and measure and evaluate are psychological things. So we need to not let it go so far apart. Lee Cronbach in 1954 argued that psychometrica, as he called it, the world of psychometrics, was a different world to the world of psychology. And I think the world has been driven even further apart, where now the world of psychometrics, here placed in one of my favorite cities, Hong Kong, relative to clinical psychology in China. But education's bigger than that. It's the rest of the world. And so the world of psychometrics doesn't influence psychology very much, but the power of tests on schools, on education, is sometimes bizarre and unjustified. But it has a huge impact. But those fields of psychology, psychometrics, and education don't seem to be talking very well to each other as they've developed in their separate directions. So we use tests, but do we understand what they're doing and why they're doing it that way? And does psychometrics really understand education? So I think we've reached a stage where we have a whole bunch of isolated silos. Psychometrics in one, psychology in another, technology, curriculum, the classroom environment, the evaluation principles and methods, testing, data. They're all connected, but they live in certain separate worlds. So you can imagine here at EARLI, we're in a world where these things all have to talk to each other. So where are we now? And I thank Bruno Zumbo for this insight of the difference between in vivo, the living environment, and the in vitro, the controlled laboratory environment in a test tube. And I think this is where we're at now, where these two worlds are actually diverged, where the real world is separate from the laboratory world. We have a world now where we have high stakes that have certain fundamental presumptions and assumptions. The assumptions is that all the extraneous factors that happen outside of the room in which you take the test are just random error. But psychology will show this is not random. There are systematic things. And that every test taker on every test will make 100% effort. And we've seen from psychological studies, probably reported here, that students don't try all the time. So therefore, in this model, we only need to care about, are the items correct in terms of content and difficulty? Do they discriminate positively? Have we controlled for guessing? Were there enough items to get a reliable estimate of ability? And is the test score a reasonably accurate representation of the domain and the student's quality of the performance and relative rank in that domain? And we can mathematically model these parameters. But they're tests. And tests don't always, in molecular studies, biology, the world says, actually, things when you study them in isolation in a laboratory don't always behave the same way when you put them out in the real world, when they're interacting with things that you didn't control that are actually there. So many in vitro studies reach false conclusions because they fail to replicate the precise cellular conditions of an organism. And I would say that's also true of classrooms, whether it's a university classroom, a tutorial room, or a school classroom or a kindergarten space. Those spaces are not the same as test spaces. First of all, there's a teacher in the classroom who has varying degrees of content knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge and knowledge for self-regulation and how good she is at self-regulating. This changes the environment from the test tube, the environment where the researcher is an expert in the field. It's also happening on the fly. Classrooms are not static. There's 30 of these kids, or sometimes more, one teacher, and everything's happening dynamically, and teachers have to detect the dynamic things on the fly. And they have to give a response here and now. They can't wait till, after I've analyzed this video clip of you that we've just made of our interaction, I'll go in the back room and I'll study that and talk to an expert, and we'll do a systematic coding, and then I'll come back with my answer. That doesn't happen. So the research world doesn't look like the real world. And of course, most teachers are not experts in psychometrics and even numbers, and their whole goal is trying to figure out in the moment, on the fly, who should I teach what next to? This is the fundamental conundrum. What should I be doing next instead of what I'm doing now? because we don't want teachers in an environment where they have to think, well, I just need to repeat it only louder so that they will understand it better. Einstein suggested that was insanity. So classroom assessment is actually a reversion to the old tradition of making a judgment based on classroom processes and products and interactions. It's back to that old model of an expert making judgments. But under new conditions, it's in the moment. It's not just at the end when you've done a test, but it's actually while the instruction is ongoing. And it's not just using a test. There's all sorts of data collection tools that teachers are expected to use with this function of not just judging it summatively, but figuring out who needs to be taught what next and giving that message to those students. This is a very different kind of world than the testing world. And one of the innovations since the late 1990s, thanks to Dylan William and Paul Black's seminal work, is the notion of assessment for learning. Now, I have my qualms about whether this is actually assessment. I think it's really good teaching, but this is hard work to clarify the intentions, making it sure that students know what they're supposed to learn and how it will be judged and what quality looks like. And engineering those classrooms. Notice they did use the word engineering. It's not just, making it up. You're supposed to engineer it, which was one of the points that I think Kapoor was trying to argue about, engineering these discussions and questions and tasks. And then providing feedback that moves kids forward instead of just leaving them, oh, thanks, you told me how bad I am, or, oh, good, you told me how good I am. And activating students, getting students involved. And activating them not only to assess, evaluate, but also teach, which is always challenging because some of them are much more novice than the teacher. This is hard work. This is not the easiest kind of model for teaching. But those processes happen in a very complex space that's surrounded by societal norms, policies and cultures, family traditions and languages and values, where the individual comes as an entity in a social space, and they have motivations and affect and cognition. And then there's all this stuff that happens where the teacher is teaching and giving them tasks, and all of this happens with their environment, and hopefully it leads to greater outcomes and proficiency. And this is a complicated space, but fortunately it's a space that psychology has a lot to tell us about. Psychological theories that I'm familiar with, and sometimes that familiarity is a hand wave, and sometimes I actually know something about the theory. But these are things that we've learned from Reinhard Peckeren. We know something about activating emotions help improve outcomes. We know that mastery goals and motivations lead to greater outcomes. We know that having a belief that learning is supposed to be deep and transformational rather than just regurgitation leads to better outcomes. We know that if you believe that intelligence is something you can change, you tend to develop and learn more. We know that if you believe that assessment is to help you identify things that you could focus on to do better, that also helps you do better. If you believe that things are under your control and that you have some agency, you tend to do better. We know that if you make an effort, you do better. Isn't that a good news story? Effort matters. We know that if you take an honor oath and say, I won't cheat, and my colleagues will judge me if I cheat, you tend to get more integrity and honesty in a system. We know that if you trust your peers, you're more likely to listen to them and respect what they have to say about your learning. We also know that the goal in evaluating your own work is to somehow be realistic and veridical about how does my work, my processes relate to the standards and the criteria that the community uses. And if you make learning your primary goal instead of protecting your ego, you tend to learn more. Because finding out that you're not good at something can be threatening to your ego. So we want you to be able to say, these things. So psychology has a lot to say about factors and processes in classrooms that lead to better outcomes. And I think we've heard in this conference in previous years as well how little teachers believe, respect, implement the science of psychology in terms of learning and teaching. Data is everywhere. Thanks to the computers, we have data up the yin-yang, and schools are full of data and very little understanding of that data. And data-based decision-making seems to be a useful technique for improving outcomes, where teachers engage with data, not just tests, but all sorts of assessment and data, but in an environment where they're not going to be punished for poor results. I think if anything we can take from the school accountability testing system is that when you judge people and scare people with accountability testing, the first thing they do is comply and give you high scores. And high scores can be obtained through many nefarious ways other than actually increasing learning. So we're in a situation where lots of tests, lots of assessment data, little understanding of what's really going on, and what we found in New Zealand that practices where universities and schools work together in partnership with substantial external funding from the government. What you find is that it takes anywhere from 18 to 36 months of teacher professional development in analyzing the data and thinking about what works and what isn't working before you see an effect on students. This is slow. And somebody said, but what if, Gavin, you've done a lot of work. You've contributed to this. So I want to just mention a few little things that I've done to contribute to this. Certainly in this book, I talked a lot about the importance of if the assessment doesn't tell the teacher who needs to be taught what next, it probably isn't a very informative test because most teachers already know best and worst in my class. And so if that's all you're going to tell me, then your test isn't very helpful. We've also seen that in self-assessment, for many good psychological reasons, students don't tell the truth about themselves to themselves or to their teacher or to their classmates. And this is why I've reached the conclusion that self-assessment is a very good curricular activity to develop and contribute to the skill of self-regulated learning, but is a terrible assessment. Feedback. There you will have heard rumbles of debates about the nature of feedback, and my conclusion is perhaps different to others, that as long as people are free will beings and have autonomy and agency, they don't have to listen to teachers or feedback or their peers or their mothers. And what I found is that there are certain beliefs about the nature of assessment that do contribute to greater performance. If you believe that assessment is a mechanism that is legitimate to tell you what you need to do next, what you have mastered and what you need to learn, then it tends to be productive for greater achievement. And students who think it's irrelevant, a pain in the neck, not important, crumple it up, throw it away, they tend to do worse. And as Pap talked about, this handbook, thanks to many of the contributors to that handbook, what we know is that culture and contextual norms really change assessment, and they change how we think about assessment and how we do assessment. And assessment isn't the same around the world, and it does matter. You have to really pay attention to those factors. So where are we going? I was really taken with this quote from William Gibson. If you've never read The Neuromancer, you should read this speculative fiction, which is what we now call science fiction. William Gibson said, "The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And what I want to show you is how some of the future is already starting to happen in various parts of the world, and we have choices to make about whether we want it or not. What I want in the future is a world where all of these sectors interact around educational assessment. That's the insights of psychology inform curriculum and classroom practices and the design of curriculum, the technologies that support humans to do this complicated, difficult stuff, and where we use the data to monitor whether it's working or not. I want a world where what humans need and want, helped by machines, rather than machines telling humans what to value and what to do. We're in a world where big data exists, and big data is kind of scary, because how can you argue with data? And it's a real problem for us. So we can now not just evaluate the answer, right, wrong, high, middle, low. We can also now look at the processes that used to get that answer. And organizations like the PISA test and the TIMSS test are starting to experiment on large scale with the processes. And the assumption is that if we try to emulate the real world, it will increase validity on a computer. And that is a claim that I think we need to still be critical of. Learning analytics is turning all of that data into some sort of usable knowledge so that you can link it to various processes and tools using some sort of statistical engine to analyze the data. And this is where I start to get nervous, because those statistical black boxes are often not transparent. We don't actually always know what's going on in them. And they're often atheoretical. They're just machine mining. Find the most optimal solution through all of this data to the outcome that we know. And that can be dangerous in my view. And I'm somewhat optimistic that the European approach to data transparency around algorithms and heuristics going into some of these AIs and machine learning will perhaps save us from a true black box tyranny. This approach is being implemented, and here are a few examples that Alina van der Veer drew my attention to of companies that are actually offering now promising, individualized, appropriate, and adaptive, not just assessments, but learning resources. So there are companies out there exploiting questions, curriculum, and tools to create your own personalized, technologically mediated education. And ACT Next are working with this whole idea of computational psychometrics to blend psychometric and statistical theory with computer science, machine learning, to analyze this complex data, leading to the smartphone systems where you can monitor and control your learning, and where the machine back in the backdrop will say, based on these things, this is what you should be doing next. This is coming towards us already and exists in places already. This is a screenshot from a digital performance test that ETS is developing, and these are very clever, and it's an avatar, a scientist in the white lab coat, the student, and interacting with the student at the computer terminal, and where the computer says, here's some data, here's what these two people said, what do you think? Now this is really good. It's like individual questioning and prompting, but I would much rather we had this in a laboratory with a real teacher in a real classroom in a real environment. Nonetheless, this is how you might get at standardized data for around that. But it's important to remember that data do not explain themselves. And this is one of the points that Judea Pearl is really strong on. And I highly recommend his book, The Book of Why. And his claim is that causal questions can never be answered from data alone. Data do not answer themselves. They require us to formulate a model of the process that generates the data, or at least some aspect of that process. And this is what psychology is so good at, developing theories and attempts to explain how or why does this happen. And in fact, this example of a study, Samuel Greif's team, who analyzed the PISA climate control process data, and they said, well, it's so much data, it's hard to make sense of it, until they sat down and said, well, how should you solve this? And they came up with this, well, the optimal exploration strategy is vary one thing at a time. And when they imposed that framework on the data, it began to make sense. They began to find the people who were performing optimally and seeing where the suboptimal, leading to wrong answers or really slow responding, what strategies were going on. But you had to have a theory about how does this work. Because I read a lot of speculative fiction, I remembered this story. Isaac Asimov in the early 1950s. It's a future world where children learn individually with machine tutors who test and adapt work. And Margie is one of the children in the story, and she's thinking about the old schools they had when her grandfather's grandfather was a little boy. All the kids from the whole neighborhood came, laughing and shouting in the schoolyard, sitting together in the schoolroom, going home together at the end of the day. They learned the same thing so they could help one another on the homework and talk about it. And the teachers were people. The mechanical teacher was flashing on the screen. When we add fractions, 1/2 and 1/4, and Margie was thinking about how the kids must have loved it in the old days, she was thinking about the fun they had. Honestly, I do not want a world for my grandchildren who are growing up in Sweden where this horrible world where all education happens through a tutoring machine actually happens. I don't want that, and I don't think we as humans should want it. But the inconvenient truth is that computerized assessments and technological systems integrating computer assessments with computer learning tools are getting better all the time. And politicians seem to like the promise of this technology, and especially around testing. And if we can reduce the cost of expensive teachers with patient machines, the world will be better. And we should be wary that the politicians who get more votes tend to not like teachers as much as we might like teachers. But the problem with these approach of machines is what theories can explain the processes and the humans behind the data? Will computers actually assess the things we care about, or only the easy things that you can put on a computer? How will we keep the data private? How will access to these tools and resources be universal and equitable? How will we keep our humanity when everything happens through the machine? And how do we manage humans in the real world who don't behave according to the lab experiments or the statistical models or the algorithms behind these machines? So I think in the terms of the immediate future, what we're heading to is probably not computerized schooling. I hope we avoid that. But I do think we can use computers to help teachers and students in the real world. And that, I think, is where we need to go. That technologies that can help in classroom assessments and not take over the classrooms and replace the teacher. And I want to identify 2 complementary technologies that have been developed in New Zealand, Aotearoa. The first is the e-ASTL system, which I worked on with John Hattie for 5 years, and which cost the New Zealand government somewhere in the vicinity of 20 million New Zealand dollars, which is only 12 million euros, so it's cheap. It's a tool where kids take tests online, adaptively, but the reports are for the teachers to say, these are the kids who need to be taught that. On the whole, you're doing better than average, but still, these kids need to be taught these things. And so I think that's a really useful technology. And I want to shout out to my colleague Paul Denny at the University of Auckland, who invented the Peerwise system. That is a very simple technological interface in which students create multiple choice questions on the course they're taking, and classmates take those questions, answer them, debate if the answer is correct, and comment on the quality of the questions. This is a learning tool that technology uses by exploiting the simple fact that self-testing is a good way to learn. So this is the kind of technologies that I think can make the world a better place in education, and we should be working to build more such tools. So to remind you, this is where I want us to go, not where I think we're going necessarily, but where I think we want to go. We want the psychologists to work more closely with the curriculum people and the classroom people to say, this is what we can tell you works better than what you're doing. Now, I saw some sessions in this week where, boy, it's really hard to change those teachers and teacher mindsets. It's very difficult to change. We're not looking at something that's going to happen overnight. We have to keep working at it. Where we can use technologies informed by psychological principles and classroom contexts, and where we can use the data to say what's working and what doesn't, where we can involve teachers in querying their own data. We want experts in all these fields collaborating and challenging each other to find valid solutions that work for humans. Which means, I think this is one of the things I like about EARLI. There's lots of cross-disciplinary researchers talking to each other across these fields. So that's what I hope we're going towards. I'm not sure we're going to get there, but that's what I'm hoping we're working towards. And as a last thank you, I want to say kia kaha, which means great strength, to my mentors and collaborators. And if you were in New Zealand, I would give you a chocolate fish if you could name everybody on the screen. Thank you, Pat, for being one of those people. On the yes, that's the left. On the left side are senior professors who've guided me, advised me, shaped me, but it's my fault if I don't say what they would have said. And on the right are some of the collaborators with whom I've done the most work, and I want to say thanks to all of them for helping me to get here, and I thank you for coming to listen to me. Thank you very much.
We have plenty of time now for not just questions, let's have discussions, conversations around the points that you have heard Gavin raise. And there will be microphones running at you. So who would like to get us going in terms of deep thoughts about assessment? Right here. Alex?
Hello? Hello? Okay. I'm wondering what you think about the role of authentic assessment, where assessment is inherent in the learning. So I'm thinking about something like writer's workshop, when students actually engage in peer editing and get feedback from teachers, and whether that's potentially a way of getting at some of this complexity in real-time assessment that you're talking about.
Absolutely. We must remember, though, that in an educational environment, authentic assessment is still a sheltered workshop because we allow failure because that's where you're going to learn. When you go out into the real world, failure is not tolerated extremely much. You're supposed to be good enough not to fail. So in an educational context, authentic assessment means we're going to challenge you, we're going to support you to do something close to the real thing, but allow you to fail and not succeed as part of the learning process. So I think it's a great idea as a way of trying to simulate or emulate the real world, but it is still artificial compared to the real world, and it's supposed to be artificial because it's an educational learning environment. But it is part of the real world, and this is something I say when I talk about authentic assessment, that it is still part of the real world to know stuff. So you have to know stuff, so it's legitimate to give you some assessments of that kind, and then you have to be able to use stuff and integrate it. So, yeah, that's, you know, if you don't know the word left and you don't know right, you want to know that stuff. So there are some component knowledges that you are probably not very much gray between them, but the complex stuff, the stuff that I've done assessment of writing. Writing is not forming letters. It's composition. Composition is difficult, and that's complex. And then there's a really good answer and a really poor answer and many, many shades of gray in between. And you could be a poor answer for many different reasons. So good learning, deep learning, real learning is still an approximation of the real world. Thank goodness, because we need space to not know and fail and be coached and supported to improve.
Thanks for your talk. Thanks for your talk, Gavin. Appreciate it. So along that same lines, I wonder about the PISA data and the TIMS that you had. They were looking at kind of the process data and the idea that that control a variable strategy, or that one piece at a time, because I think there would be scientists that would in the physical and natural sciences that would disagree that that's always necessarily the best. So are there systems in which we can open up kind of multiple avenues of the processes as well as the products?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that because the OECD PISA test was designed for 15-year-olds and they made it a really simple task, so that simple algorithm was a valid way of analyzing that data because it was such a constrained task. And I'm not enough of a scientist to know, but I would assume that eventually they want to... It's going to be really hard to create the kind of assessments outside of a real human situation where humans are working on science to test those things. So if so much of learning is part of that apprenticeship of observation and participation, as the socioculturalists would talk about, then I don't know how you can build that into a machine, because that's too, we're struggling to get machines smart enough to figure out, do I need an umbrella today? So one of my colleagues in Hong Kong, he's going, oh, no, don't worry about that, Gavin. It isn't going to happen. We're not smart enough to write that code yet to make machines truly intelligent. It's artificial intelligence in many ways, in the sense that it's not like real human intelligence. And I don't know how soon we'll ever get there, if we get there. I can barely see them.
Thank you, Gavin, for giving us those insights. Yeah, you cautioned against removing the human from education through the use of technology, for example, that will perhaps provide the role of a teacher. What do you see of the implications of that for feedback? I'm thinking about systems that use algorithms to provide automated comments to students. What do you think are the implications of that for dialogic exchanges in feedback where human agents are involved?
Well, if I understood the question correctly, Naomi, it's machines are, well, like I said just previously, that we're not writing machine code that can mimic humans very much in terms of that nuanced judgment of, yeah, there's 53 spelling mistakes here, but really the bigger issue is this. Machines, as we know from using Microsoft Word, are really good at identifying spelling, punctuation, grammar, but they have no clue about composition. So the nuanced expert can make that kind of judgment. So will the feedback to learners be, well, put it this way, some simple feedback quickly may be better than nuanced feedback slowly, depending on the learners. So maybe if I can clean up all those surface errors, I might actually get a fairer reading than from someone who just goes, oh, spelling mistakes, not on my watch. So I would say tools to help us deliver better work could be good, but I doubt that the machines can do what humans can do. And the problem is, too many teachers focus on what the machine can do instead of what the bigger picture, the balanced overall nuanced judgment. It's easier to do there's 53 spelling mistakes here, go away and fix that, rather than to comment on, but actually your story structure makes a lot of sense, and congratulations. It's much harder to do that than to go, oh, you forgot full stops, F. The machine can do that, humans do that, because we tend to substitute the obvious for the important. And that's really what teachers and humans and expert instructors and good feedback givers focus on, the important, not just the obvious. I hate my teacher, this feedback means she hates me. Well, that is the thing that we just saw in that symposium on feedback, is that it is an interpersonal and intrapersonal and social thing. Feedback from a machine might be trusted simply because the machine has no agenda. But a human is always perceived as having an agenda that may be hard to tell. Almost all of us remember a teacher who was horrible, and a few of us remember a wonderful teacher. The horrible teachers color the relationship. We hope we're good teachers and have positive relationships, but I don't know. Those factors color all those educational processes, whether it's the design of assessment or the nature of feedback. Is it on?
Just start talking.
Ah.
Start talking. No, because sometimes we just want to talk.
Sometimes they... Dead battery? Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Eric. Yay, for
Hooray!
persisting.
Right. Right. All right. The question that I had for you, Gavin, I really like what you said about the in vitro and in vivo type of assessment. One of the things that we've seen an awful lot is sort of educational funders, be they government or external agencies, really like the sort of true experiment, randomized control, randomized experimental design. What is it that we can, and it was mentioned at the start of this conference as well by Jeroen van Marienburg. And so what is it that we can do to try and convince policymakers that actually the randomized, or the true experiment is actually not an authentic way to do measuring of assessment?
Oh.
Sorry.
Gee, thanks for the easy question. Well, I think sometimes we have to grapple with the challenge of the true experiment a little more aggressively and try to do some of those. And we do need to work to persuade ourselves as a community of researchers that there's more than one way of doing good research. Just because I don't like doing it doesn't mean it's bad research. And so, you know, I like to do large-scale survey research with fancy statistics. That's my preference. But I like to work with people who are phenomenographic and very detailed stuff, doing interpretive stuff. And if you can get it peer-reviewed and published, and then you can turn it into a, so what should we do? If this is true, what should we do? I think it was Kurt Lewin who said in the 1930s, if you understand something, try to control it. And maybe what we need is, whether it's a full RCT or actually a manipulation, a treatment study of some sort, we need to try and do that stuff more. Having theories about how things work is necessary and nice, but not enough. We need to test them to destruction to see, does it really work? Royston Corcoran in Nottingham University is actually trying to propagate RCTs in education. And I think there are ways to do it, but it's not the whole shooting match. And we need to argue for that. We need to believe in it. We need to accept those papers and not reject them just because they're not our methodological preference. But we need to try and do some of the control. Oh, Jan Willem.
Okay, yeah, if I hold it closely, it'll probably be loud enough. Not sure whether this is going to be a hard or an easy question. I'll leave it up to you to decide. In terms of diplomas and certificates, we haven't really addressed that issue, and in the age of accountability, that is important. And one of the things that in discussions that I have with one of my PhD students, the issue of what we can do individually and what we can do collaboratively continuously pops up. And in terms of diplomas and certifications, we tend to emphasize the individual over the collaborative. But then on the other hand, what we are doing here at this conference, there's a lot of knowledge generated, and it's not that we just all sit by ourselves during coffee breaks. So what are your views on that, and what would be the implications for diplomas and certification?
Well, the Vice Chancellor academic of my university says, group work is wonderful, but we only give degrees to individuals. And you, as an individual, get the honors, the bachelor, the master's, or the doctorate. So we would have to change our incentive reward system, which could be problematic because for over 2,000 years, we've used certification assessments for summative purposes to reward individuals, not groups of individuals. So it would we'd have to really rethink the nature of what does a certificate mean, what does a degree mean if it's only because of what I can do as a team rather than what I can do by myself. And you could argue, well, the modern world is all teamwork and so on, but those of us who are good working by ourselves often hate working with people who are not good by working by themselves. So I don't know. I still think in many situations in the real world outside of education, in employment, in careers and vocations, it's not what the team does, it's what you contribute to the team and what you're able to do by yourself, which is what we're trying to mimic or predict in our assessments, that you have high potential to contribute a lot in this corporate environment. But it's, I hire this person. You don't bring 6 people and it's hire us all or none of us. Well, that was too easy. Just all of you are excluded. I only need one person. So many of our jobs and careers, one of my daughter's partner is a builder. Yes, there's a company that he works with, and maybe you'd hire that company, but you also go, well, this guy is very good, and I want him. I can leave the rest of the company. And that's, so the real world still relies on the individual, not just the team. And until we go to a world where only the team gets hired or fired, or where only the team does the work, not the individuals, I suspect that we still have to focus on the individual. David, please.
It's the other aspect of Jan Williams' question that I wanted to pick up on. Is this working? Yeah, good. We have processes of certification of certificates and people getting recognised in a public sense for their achievements. And this is a normal part of the society in which we live. We're coming out of a tradition in which these certificates were norm referenced. They were people judged against other people in their cohort or their class, or in some sense against other people, not against absolute standards. And a lot of the psychometrics that you referred to in your historical overview very much focus on assumptions that aren't assumptions about judging individuals against particular standards and criteria in the public certification sense. Can you say something about how you see the challenges to some of our psychometric traditions in assessment in the context in which certification needs to be more transparent, and people that look at other people's certificates know what on earth they mean? Because at the moment, most of the certificates we give to students at almost every level are completely non-transparent.
Thank you, David. Yeah, a lot of norming is about establishing the rank order, and most of the statistics require the notion of a normal distribution or a Gaussian curve, because that's actually how a lot of things behave. And but when you say, well, I want a mastery model where I could allow 100% of people to meet the standard rather than only force 5% to be in the elite grade, that does change the nature of the statistics. And fortunately, my colleagues who write handbooks have chapters where they say, when you handle this kind of phenomenon, these are the kinds of statistics that you have to use. And as I mentioned glibly, the notion of setting a cut score of this is the standard and your characteristics do not meet that standard, those cut scores and standard setting is really, there's a lot of black art in there. One of the techniques that we used multiple techniques when we were developing the ASTEL system in New Zealand. One of the techniques we found that really worked well was the bookmark. So what we had was a set of items in a content area that had been item response theory scored from very easy to very hard. We picked 30 items in a content area that increased more or less equally between items, and we said, show us where you think the next curriculum level begins, and where does the one after that begin? And if you don't think this curriculum level is here, don't put the bookmark in. And what we tended to find was very quickly the item that triggered a change in perception of qualitative difficulty. Everyone agreed item 13 represents a change, and they completely disagreed. Was this the beginning of level 5, the middle of level 5, the top of level 5, or even possibly the beginning of level 6? But they all recognized that something about number 13 communicates a change in qualitative competence. And then we would lock them in a room and they would debate and discuss, and then we'd not feed them until they re-voted. And then we do this multiple times in a day until you find a central tendency of how people set the cut score for the different levels. The real problem is capturing what were the reasons that number 13 is the cut score, and why did you think it was level 5 and I thought it was level 6? That is the part of how you create the standard that is really difficult to do. And I'm not aware of people who have automated capturing the debates and discussions that lead to a cut score setting. And of course, everybody who happens to be just on below the cut score or just above the cut score consider themselves incredibly unlucky or lucky. But all human judgment has a cut score. We say this is a pass, this is a fail. But there are statistics for working out how similar are judgments and ways of looking at the distribution that you want. Did you want well, our university grades are not norm referenced explicitly by policy. So if you do a really good job, you should be able to get 100% of your students get an A. Now, somebody might raise their eyebrow and go, how did you do that without making it? Like you gave them the answers, or you only gave really easy questions. But the next course should hopefully cancel that out, or when they go to grad school or go to get a job and they discover, oh, all the students at University of Auckland got A's, but they're really dumb in the real world because they don't know the stuff that we expect them to know. That would cancel that out. So we're trying to mimic authentic world with our standards. But as you know, Bill Angoff said, you scratch a standard and you tend to find a norm underneath. What we describe as excellent work tends to be the kind of work that a small proportion of students can actually do. Now, can you teach them all to do that? You can teach them. That doesn't mean they all learn to do that. But it is a challenge to get away from the notion of modifying the grades to reflect a normal distribution or a preferred distribution. And we're working hard in my university with the assessment policy and practices to get through to the people the idea that you're not moving things statistically. You're making a judgment of what does the work look like that's a pass or B or an A. And that's, can you get two people to agree more or less on where the cut falls? And maybe you make some compromises and it's fuzzy, but you're trying to work for expert judgment. And that's why I do like the language you guys use at Cradle on evaluative judgment. It's a judgment of evaluation, and it's fuzzy, it's not precise. There's a study published in the last year or two where a group of people assembled a data file and gave it to multiple groups to analyze. They came up with something like 27 different ways to analyze that same data set, and not every analysis led to the same conclusion about whether X had worked better than Y or whatever the data was about. So even in my field of statistical analysis, there's always a judgment call about what procedure, and that can lead to different conclusions. So we're humans. Fuzzy is probably okay. Yes, sir.
Yes. I don't think I need the mic. Okay.
Please, use it anyway.
Okay. You're talking a little bit about, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying about theoretical and atheoretical models and statistical algorithms not having a theoretical background to them. And so at what point does an atheoretical model become a theoretical model? At what point are we now talking about this as, well, this is what we found in the data, and now we've normed this? At what point do we take those and make that the theory that breaks the other theories that you were talking about, to that extent? And how do we know?
I've talked to Eduardo Cascajar about this. He's done a number of neural network analyses of university data where students have provided data on cognitive, metacognitive, affective variables throughout the university process. And he's trying to predict whether you passed, failed, or got a high grade or a low grade, but still passed. And he runs his neural network, and then he says, then we post facto attempt to explain what was going on, what variables loaded strongly through these hidden spaces in the neural net. But it's a post facto speculation as to what those variables are. But he's also familiar with the research literature and can say this is coherent with, but then it does mean you would want to explicitly test it. Can I manipulate this to get the result I want? And that is sort of the holy grail of education, isn't it? To find the levers that make kids achieve. Yeah, that's hard work for us because much of achievement comes from factors outside the classroom and the teacher's capabilities and responsibilities. John Hattie's meta-analyses suggest that at least 50% of what kids do and achieve comes out of their home backgrounds and the individual variant differences in their homes, socioeconomics, and their genetics. So, yeah, teachers can't be made responsible for that. Yeah, Valerie.
Kia ora, thank you, Gavin. If we think back about Bandura and good old Bobo Doll, one of the things that you take away, obviously, is the learning performance distinction, right? That there is a difference between whether you've learned something versus how you've performed. And I'm curious, because I get frustrated with assessment and evaluation, are we actually measuring learning, or are we only measuring how a student performs on our evaluation? So I don't expect an answer, really, but just curious what some of your thoughts might be.
Yeah.
Do I deserve an answer? Woo!
Performance on the tasks that were set, which are hopefully a sample of the domain that you're supposed to learn, should be an indication of learning. However, if they can get a high score without coming to class or reading the book, that maybe suggests your task wasn't very well designed to prevent smart people getting high marks without learning anything. And that is the tension. My father never believed that I should have got an A in school because I never worked hard enough. Students who can do it quickly and easily, but it's new to them, but they can still do it quickly and easily and get a high mark on the test. If they didn't know it before, I guess that was learning. Now, you could memorize test items. It's a kind of learning. It's not learning. It is a learning. It's a way of learning, and it's a substance of learning. But how will you cope when you get something you haven't seen before? That's ultimately, can you go back to first principles? Do you understand the fundamental principles? That's what we're trying to achieve. But at the same time, mom and dad want to make sure that they can get a high score, because high scores allow certain opportunities. And we should never be naive about that. Yes, miss, again.
Thank you. I had a question related to an earlier comment where I think underlying a lot of the computer-based assessment is the implicit assumption that data should be quantitative and feedback and kind of what we know about learning should be quantitative. But at the same time, when I think about that list you showed of the important high-level skills, the kind of feedback we give on writing, the kind of feedback we give on how somebody works as part of a group is oftentimes very qualitative. That's what's meaningful. So I'm wondering what you see in terms of the role of qualitative data in computer assessment.
It's not what computers are very good at. We haven't written the code to make the computers good at detecting that stuff. Now, you could probably program a database of responses to certain indicators, and the computer might detect that indicator in a computer text and supply that response. Our solution in New Zealand would be we designed it to do some pre-scoring. The machine looks at, we think these answers are correct, we think these answers are wrong, but the human validates or vets that. So could you create a database that says, when you see these indicators, give this feedback, but the human checks it? That might be a solution.
So I'm thinking about the way that we teach teachers, for example, to assess writing. And what we say is you should use a rubric, at least in the United States. And what it essentially does is it kind of quantifies qualitative feedback, and what we're teaching students to do is essentially sort responses into different groups of quality. And computers are pretty good at those kinds of sorting tasks. And so I guess where I was thinking maybe this could go is rather than quantifying and collecting more, how much time did you spend, whatever data, we could teach computers to better discern patterns in responses in these more qualitative ways. And I know there's work being done on that.
That is the work of automatic essay scoring since Ellis Page's amazing article in 1968, where he showed that the computer scored it more consistently with any of the human judges than the human judges did with each other. And he had programmed his machine to simply go long text, high score, passive voice, high score, polysyllabic words, high score. And so he just gave it a bunch of language rules, and what that tells us is that essay markers tend to be seduced by language competence, not necessarily content knowledge. And I read an article quite some time ago. Rich Shavelson and his colleagues showed that you could find out if students knew content without having to write an essay by getting them to fill in a concept map. A partially complete concept map can be scored accurately and can demonstrate whether students understand the structure of this knowledge space. It's not a test of how well they can write, but then again, I think it was a Pogo cartoon that I read somewhere in the 60s or 70s where this kid's walking to school and he goes, I'm ready for the test of geography. I know everything there is to know about Iceland. And then the essay says, write an essay about Ireland. And he goes, gets a bright idea and he writes, Iceland is a country not to be confused with Ireland. Ireland is, and then he writes his essay about Ireland. So the question is, should he get a good mark or not? Yeah. So, yeah, and of course, all the training of automatic essay scoring is trying to mimic what humans give. And what humans give is often confused with language skills rather than substance. Okay. Chris. Yeah.
Hi. What do you think about giving a lot of information to students about how they will be assessed? I often think if you give less information about the assessment that is coming, they will learn more in the end.
Oh, you're caught in that vexed issue of transparency of criteria and learning intentions, which is one of the key principles of assessment for learning. But of course, no matter how verbose your description of the learning intentions and criteria, there are always invisible things that we also use but we forgot to mention. I think what you're trying to get at is the kind of things that Manu Kapoor was talking about in terms of giving them an opportunity to discover lots of multiple solutions before discovering the best one or the optimal solution. Students are very driven strategically. And our university has a policy, and like many universities, you must tell people in advance how they will be assessed and how they will be scored. So we're kind of caught in a power situation where we have to do that, and we have to usually announce it at least 2 weeks before the course starts. Fortunately, the research on motivations say that deep learning and strategic learning both end up in higher performance than surface learning. So I want them to be deep learners because I love my subject, and I want you to love my subject as much as I love my subject, so please love my subject by really learning it. But most people are only here in order to get the pass to get into the union or whatever they're going. So I may be cynical, but try doing it in an environment where you're legally or regulationally not allowed to do it. You can get in trouble. So if you've got an environment where you've got the freedom to experiment, maybe it'll work. It ought to work if the students are motivated for deep understanding and mastery rather than achievement.
Yeah, well, I wasn't saying it was going to make me popular as a teacher. So I was aware of this, and I was also aware of all the regulations, but maybe the regulations are wrong. The thing is that when I, as a student, knew that there was going to be a multiple choice test, I knew that they weren't going to assess me combining new pieces of information or something like this. So I knew beforehand that I didn't really need to learn this in order to pass the test.
Well, the type of assessment and the shape of that, and whether it's novel or traditional, affects how students react and feel about assessment. Again, Katrine Stuyven's here, and her work in reviewing that kind of space was very informative to me about you want to change things for good reason. Expect pushback and resistance from the learners. They like it the way they know it. So you have to negotiate the transition.
Well, Gavin, I'm going to evaluate you for a moment.
Thank you.
Discussion, and we'll have arguments over drinks later.
Good.
And first, let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I have a small token for you.
Oh,
from
good.
EARLI and from our WTH.
Thank you very much.
University.
Good. You can come and all help me eat it because, yeah, like with drinks, yes. Thank you very much, everyone.